Diane Hennacy is a practicing psychiatrist, researcher, and an expert on a number of phenomena, including the paradigm-challenging Savant Syndrome. Her research into psi phenomena is summed up in her 2008 book, The ESP Enigma, The Scientific Case for Psychic Phenomena. Links and timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the episode. So, Diane, to start us off, can you please tell me about your background and about how you first became interested in psi phenomena?
Well, my background is that of a neuroscientist. I studied at Ohio State University at a time when neuroscience wasn't even a major. And so technically, my background was in physiological psychology. And I was really interested in the fact that you had scientists looking at the brain, and certain areas of the brain could be damaged either on purpose or by accident. And then you would see these behavioral syndromes as a result. And I was also studying comparative psychology, which is the study of behavioral differences among the different species. And so we would look at the brain of, say, a reptile versus a bird versus a monkey, versus the human, and you'd be looking at changes in the brain through evolution and seeing how they correlate with changes in cognitive capacity. And so I was working out of that model at the time that I then went on to medical school at Johns Hopkins. And I was at the time interested in studying neurosurgery because neurosurgeons were mapping out the human brain by, at that time, we didn't have any really sophisticated neuroimaging technology like we do now. And so the idea was that you had somebody who had to have a tumor removed, and you would be recording the area around the tumor to see what the functionality of that area was, because you would try to preserve functionality and yet remove the tumor as much as possible. And so I thought, well, here's a way that I could help people and discover what's going on with the brain, because I really didn't want to do research on animals. And so that was really my intention in going to medical school. And along the way, I've had experiences that really challenge that whole materialist model, which is the model that I was raised with. My father was someone with a graduate degree in genetics, marine biology, and physiology, and he was the head of the artificial heart program at Battelle Memorial Institute. And so he was one of the premier scientists in the world, and I was very close with my father, and grew up as a small child, my brother and I, playing with science kits with him. I mean, as a 5-year-old, I was making crystal radios and soldering together electronics, and playing with erector sets and so I had this fascination with kind of doing little experiments and seeing how the world worked. And once I saw that that mathematics can tie in, and that you could really create order out of the universe, which in many ways seemed kind of random to me. I thought, wow, I want to be a scientist like my dad. And I thought, human behavior is just too random. No way could we understand that. But then once I studied enough about animal behavior and saw that I could predict a lot of animal behavior, I thought, oh, I bet you humans could be predicted. We just need to know more. And so I did a lot of it. And as my undergraduate work, I did not only work in, where I was taking courses, but I took a lot of graduate level courses, and I was working in a lot of laboratories. I did work with electron microscopes. I did work where I was making electrodes that you could insert in the axon of a crayfish axon, and you could look at the changes in the electrical potential as you put drugs in there that would alter the flow of calcium through these calcium channels. And so I was doing cutting edge neuroscience work, and I had already gotten a publication as an undergraduate before going to medical school. And so I went off to medical school, and I graduated at the top of my class. And so I had all of these opportunities for which medical school I wanted to go to. I decided to go to Johns Hopkins because I wanted to work with Saul Snyder at the time. And this was when neuropeptides were brand new. And I had worked in a laboratory where I was doing research with doing electrical recording and using some of these neuropeptides, something like the body's endogenous opiates and other messenger chemicals. And I thought, oh, well, that's an interesting thing to study. And so I wanted to work with him, get an MD and a PhD, and be, research in this field. And the thing is that once I got to medical school and neuroimaging started to get developed, and I started really looking at things, I thought, I really like being able to sit and talk with somebody and really explore the kind of the landscape of their, of their mind, and and what they and have them and hear the stories of their behavior, and then study what's going on and try to make the correlations with their brain. So I decided to switch from neurosurgery to neuropsychiatry, and so I did that, and I was at Johns Hopkins for 8 years. I did all of my training there, and then went on to Harvard afterwards. And at the time, I became really, really interested in autism. So I went over to London and spent 6 months with Sir Michael Rutter, who was knighted for his work on autism. And I became fascinated by autism because I would meet these children who couldn't speak. And I saw that the parents were really, really desperate to understand what was going on with their child, and also desperate in terms of just wanting their child to have, a life. And when you have a child that isn't capable of communicating, then it really makes it hard to envision them having much of a life, whether you're talking about a career or a social life. And I found them fascinating and a huge mystery, but there was so little autism at the time that when I was looking at, what to do my research on at Harvard, it's like, well, there's not enough autism. Believe it or not, back then there was not enough autism for me to make that my field of study. And so I focused more on the dementias, things like Alzheimer's and Huntington's and Parkinson's, and really looking at sort of the decline of cognitive function, and then what parts of the brain have changed as a way of trying to understand, well, what the different sections of the brain are, what their contribution to cognition is. And then along the way, while I'm at Harvard, I am asked to do this consultation on a patient who wants to leave the hospital against medical advice. And if someone is insane, then they're not really judged to be competent enough to decline treatment. In other words, and so that's kind of intuitively obvious, that if somebody, if they have some belief system that's just totally out of, keeping with reality, then, how can you think that you can really have an informed discussion with them about a life-threatening matter? And with this woman, it was that she had been admitted for a possible heart attack the night before. Right. And she wanted to leave because she was seeing ghosts, and she, claimed to be psychic, and she knew the tests were going to come back normal. And so she's like, just please let me leave. And any other psychiatrist who would have walked in that room would have just said, well, I'm sorry, but you need to stay and sign the paperwork, because you don't have to, once again, you don't have to really think too far to realize that's somebody who's going to be deemed insane by the profession, and most people in general.
Yeah.
And so, but I'm somebody who doesn't like to play a heavy hand. I'd like to, if I could possibly get somebody to comply with treatment because they agree with it, as opposed to trying to just use such a heavy hand and just say, well, sorry, we're going to force you to stay, and if we have to tie you up and drug you to make you stay, that's what we'll do. I'm just not that kind of person. So well, I said, well, let's just sit down and talk. And she said, yeah, sure. She said, I'll talk with you. And she explained to me that she was somebody who was half Native American, half African American, and that she was born with a caul over her face, which is when you have some of the afterbirth that kind of adheres to the face and cuts off oxygen to the brain.
Right.
And so she said that there's this, this story that people born with that are psychic. And oh, well, that's interesting. And she looks at me and she says, oh, and you've got this white light around you. It's very Christ-like, and I can see you're a really good person, and I'm getting a lot of information about you. Can I tell you what I see? And I'm like, okay, sure. I'm establishing rapport with her. And then she says to me, your husband's a chemist, and my husband was a MD, PhD, and he was a biochemist. I'm like, that's interesting. She goes, oh, and he's applying for a job right now in 2 different cities. And that very week, he was applying for a job in San Diego as a postdoc, and a position back at Johns Hopkins as a postdoc. I'm just like, that's interesting. So, well, where are we going to, end up? And she goes, well, in his heart of hearts, he wants to go to one city, but he'll end up in the other city. And I knew in his heart of hearts he wanted to go back to Hopkins, because he was actually born at Johns Hopkins and 13th generation to be in Baltimore. And he had relatives back there. We had a lot of friends back there. So I knew in his heart of hearts he wanted to do that. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. She's saying we're going to end up in San Diego, and I said, well, which city do you think we're going to end up in? She said, well, name a bunch of cities and I'll tell you which one. So I named 10 different cities, and she goes, oh, San Diego, you end up in San Diego, which is, of course, where we ended up. And then she said, oh, and by the way, you'll be quite successful there, and you'll eventually leave psychiatry to write books, and you'll only have one child, and it'll be a daughter. And and all of these things came true. And she told me things about myself that, there's just no way. She knows nothing about me. You know more about me than she would. Back then we didn't have the internet. There was no way she could have looked me up or anything. And it wasn't one of those things where I was telling people at Harvard that we might be leaving because, that's just not something you do while you're, still looking, and so anyway, there was just no way that she knew this stuff. And then what that did to me was it sent me into kind of a whirlwind of questioning of wait a minute here. Okay, this paradigm that I'm operating out of. I'm just like, how is this possible? How is this possible? It doesn't make sense. And so that was in the back of my mind when we left Boston, and I still working out of the materialist model, and I'm trying to, like my father, I had this mind where I'm a polymath, and I really have studied all of these various scientific disciplines, trying to, because they all have a different sort of approach to understanding these questions. And I thought, well, I want to also understand genetics, because genes code for proteins, and, maybe that'll give us some understanding of these differences in people, because I'm just trying to understand what makes people different. And so I go on to do to work in molecular biology during the Human Genome Project. And so I get removed from psychiatry in general, and then I'm just doing all of this work. And as I said, though, in the back of my mind, I'm wondering, what happened there. And eventually I ended up leaving academia and going into private practice, because I was like, okay, what I'm really interested in, when I really sat down and asked myself, what are you really interested in? Because you make a lot of sacrifices in academia. And I was just like, I'm not going to put that much effort into something unless it's what I'm really passionate about. And I thought, what I want to know is how that woman did what she did. How did that happen? And so that's a long story, but that's what got me to this sort of journey that I've been on now for the past, I'd say 30 years.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. So that incident then, that with that lady, was that your first ever kind of encounter with something that you couldn't really explain, or that you felt didn't align with the mainstream paradigm of materialism?
Well, I would say that it's at least the second. The first time was when I was a teenager, and my brother's best friend was someone who had a job in the summer traveling with the circus with this person who did Houdini-like tricks. So he would chain himself up, he'd be chained up and then put in a tank of water, and he'd have to basically, he'd have to find a way out of that, and there's only so long you can be underwater, right? And so, and our friend's job was to break the glass in case something went wrong, and the guy couldn't escape. And so he got to travel around with this magician in the summer, and one summer, his name was Jay Michelle. One summer, Jay Michelle was in town, and Mark's like, "You've got to meet this guy." And so I meet him, and he says, "I'm going to do a magic trick for you." And he stood across the room from me, and he said, "Just pick any one of the books behind you." And there were, several hundred books behind me. He said, "Just pick any one, open it to any page, and I'll tell you what it says." And so I did that. I opened up a book. I'm looking at it. And he's way over there, and there's no mirrors or anything behind me. And then he's reading the book to me word for word. And he's like, "Set that aside. Pick up another book." He's reading it to me word for word, and I'm just like,
Wow.
How you doing that? He goes, "Oh, that's a magic trick. It's just magic." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And then then later on that day, he says, "Well, I'm going to do some tarot card reading." And he does this tarot card reading, and does it for this boy that we barely knew, who was part of, but he'd hang out with us occasionally. And he says to him, he says, "I'm so sorry you lost your mother, when you were, such, and we didn't realize that the person that he called mom was his his stepmom, that his real mother had died." And so, and he started crying when, this person said that, because he's just like, and we're all like, "How do you know this?" We don't even know this about this kid. And so, but he just said, "It's just magic. It's just magic." And I asked my dad about it, and he goes, "Well, there is this thing called telepathy." He said, "It's controversial, but there is this thing called telepathy." So so there was that in the sticking in the back of my mind. But, when you're a kid and it's magic, and, just, la di da, you just don't do much. But the thing at Harvard, that was like the second time that it made me go, And then there was a third time, which was my own experience. And what that was that one day I was shaving my legs in the shower, and I noticed this. It was bigger than the tip of a pencil, but smaller than the eraser of a pencil size mole on my ankle. And it looked, totally normal, except, I had never noticed it before. And that night I had a dream that it was melanoma, and I showed it to my, husband. And I said, "I had a dream that this is melanoma." And he goes, "Well, that's not melanoma." And I said, "Well, I know it doesn't look like melanoma." And then I had another dream that it was melanoma, and I told him about it again. He said, "That's not melanoma." And he pulls out a book and he says, "See, it's not melanoma." And I go, "Yeah, I know it doesn't look like melanoma," because it was perfectly circular, perfectly colored uniformly. It just looked like a large freckle. And so then after the third dream, my husband said, "Well," he goes, "Well, maybe you should just get it biopsied, just so that you're not having nightmares about it anymore." And I said, "Yeah, that makes sense." So I go to see my doctor, and she goes, "That's not melanoma." And I go, "I know, it doesn't look like melanoma. Could you biopsy it?" And she said, "Sure." So she biopsied it. And she was so certain that it wasn't melanoma that when I went to see her a week later to get the stitch removed, she was in a good mood. She hadn't looked at the pathology report yet. And then she opens it up and she goes, "Oh my gosh, it is melanoma." And so then I started, thinking about, wow, there's something inside of me knew something that my conscious mind was sort of, rationalizing away. Mm-hmm. And it was such an important thing to know that my unconscious kept putting it in front of me until I did something about it, and it saved my life.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you hadn't, then that would have just gotten worse and worse. And obviously, the later you find something like that, that's amazing. What were all the dreams the same? Sorry, what were you going to say then?
Well, no, they were different, in terms of what happened in the dreams.
It wasn't like a recurring dream.
No, it wasn't a recurring dream, but the central message,
recurring theme.
The recurring theme, but not recurring dream. And then, I discovered, I started looking into, well, has anybody researched this, and then I discovered that, there's all of this work that had been done, looking at dream telepathy and various other, psychic experiences that can occur when people are dreaming. And then I thought, isn't that interesting that, precognitive experiences, et cetera. And I thought, isn't that interesting? It's as though the brain has these two different modalities. We have our waking life and our dreaming life, and somehow our dreaming life can tap into information that we think of as being non-local or inaccessible. It's not, it's either not local in the sense of time, or not local in the sense of space. And so I that took me off on this journey.
Wow. Yeah, those are some amazing experiences, really. Like the dreams particularly, it's really, really amazing. How long went between the patient that you talked about in the hospital that wanted to discharge herself? How long was it after that experience before you wrote your first book?
Oh, geez.
I
would say about 17 years.
Wow.
It was about 17 years. It's interesting because after that experience, and then going to UCSD and then becoming, I actually I started working on another book. Okay, I was and so what I was working on at the time was, I was aware of, from having been at Harvard, and this is a bit of a tangent, but you'll see why it's related. When I was at Harvard, I met people from the Stone Center, which was at Wellesley, and it was a group of women who were psychologists who said the books on psychology describe men's experience, but they don't describe our experience as women. And so they started doing their own research on female psychology, and saying, and they came up with a different way of understanding, what women's way of thinking is, and the morality and and just the choices that we make. I mean, there's just a lot of differences, and what our priorities are, and just the culture of being, if you're a woman within all women, versus men being with all men, and then if you mix the groups, you'll see that it's like three different cultures. And I thought, isn't that interesting? And then I was aware of the research on animals looking at gender differences in the brain between, say, male and female rats. And what I saw, though, was that politically, in the public sphere, this was at a time period in the early 90s where it was like politically incorrect to suggest that men and women were different.
Right.
And so, I come from that generation of women who were basically saying, girls can have trucks, and boys can have dolls, and let's just, raise them more gender neutral, see what they gravitate towards, and let them be that. And a lot of the women of my generation were going, it's the boys want the trucks, and the girls seem to want the dolls, and so it was taboo to suggest that there were differences in her brain, but yet I'm like, well, that's true for rats. Why wouldn't it be true for humans? And so what I thought is, so with my mind just being the way it was, I just started, looking into, is there a way in which we could sort of take these two sets of information, the psychological information that we know now, and the animal literature, and then see how tease apart how much of these differences in gender are due to the way we're raised versus, innate biological differences, and what causes those innate biological differences. And so I actually taught, I started working on a book about that, and I taught an upper division course at UCSD on those differences. And because of my work, I was invited to be a member of this think tank that met at the Salk Institute that had several Nobel laureates as part of the group. And here I am, this, relatively young woman, and I'm with all these people who, are famous for, their work in neuroscience and, genetics and all this stuff. Yeah. And so it was a little intimidating. But I saw that they were doing in terms of trying to understand this question about human consciousness and what it is and what makes us different from animals. They were so materialistic in their way of thinking about it that I thought, I could see it for what it was in that sense. I was just like, you're never going to answer the question that way. I mean, it's like I could tell that it was we're just going to go round and around in circles. And so I reached kind of like I bloomed early in a sense, at least that bloom, because I was like, here I am. Okay. Look at this. I'm among, like V.S. Ramachandran was part of this group, and he's, a famous neurologist that goes out there and talks about phantom limb pain and this and that, and so he was one of the members of the group. Fred Gage was another member of the group, and so, I'm looking at these people who are older than me and have this reputation, and I see how they're approaching it, and it's just like, rather than staying with that group and just thinking, look, I've made it, blah blah blah, I walked away from it because I realized I knew that I wouldn't be able to get them to be on board with the kind of conversation that I wanted to have. And I thought, Diane, just study it on your own, and just study it on your own, and raise your family and do this and that. And I never dreamed I would get that I'd be able to develop the kind of understanding I have now. I never even dreamed that I would be able to do that, because this is before the internet.
Yeah.
And so the pace at which you could ask these questions and study these questions was infinitely slower than it is now. And but at the same time, there's something in me that just was like, that's what's most important. I don't want to spend my time talking about what's the genetic differences between a chimpanzee and a human, and think that that's going to somehow open up all the answers. And I think that I was proven right in the sense that within 10 years, we discovered that there's only 20,000 genes, and the mustard plant is as complex genetically as we are, and there's only like 1.5% difference in genetics, between us and chimpanzees, and yet look at the variety of human expression. And I mean, how could you explain that with genetics? That it's too simplistic. And so, and now, of course, we're looking at all of the junk DNA that's, the other 90% of the chromosomes and whatnot. But, it's going to take a while to parcel all of that out. But anyway, I just started looking, and I just know I'm going to just study what I find interesting. And so I started looking into parapsychological research, because I was like, and a lot of these people are, they're well educated, and they seemed like people like me. I mean, it seemed like I found my tribe of people that we have the scientific credentials, and we're asking these questions, and we've got the courage to just go ahead and do that.
It must have been really hard to leave that group, though, even though you kind of were set on going and doing it on your own. That must have been, yeah. You must have felt I don't know, like you're kind of stepping off a cliff in a way or something like that, like leaving this amazing situation that you found yourself in to kind of chase your dream. I don't know if it was your dream, but that kind of one way to break it down, I guess.
Yeah, and at times, it's like it's sort of like, well, am I chasing unicorns, but I was hanging on to those experiences were real. There was just they were too specific, and they weren't things that I sought out. They were something that happened that I just couldn't deny. And to me, I just have a very, very curious mind.
Yeah, that's the best way to be. So then you did a bunch of research, I'm guessing, over the years between that incident in the hospital and then your first book, the ESP Enigma, the case for scientific phenomena. Can you tell me a little bit about the book and about what went into it, and as well, I'm interested to hear a bit about how it was received, because I think I read something on your website about maybe you had a good reception overall, but maybe there were some hiccups with it, I think. But anyway, I'm interested to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, in my book, what I did was I really, because of my background as a neuroscientist, I'm in a position where I can criticize neuroscience. I can, and so part of the book is saying, okay, this is what neuroscience says is the model, and yet what exactly does that model explain? It really explains very little at all. I mean, so one of the things is they say, oh, well, the hard problem of consciousness is how can something like the brain produce something as immaterial as consciousness? We don't understand, but there's this almost like you cannot question the assumption that the brain creates consciousness. So, it's just like, so I saw, so I talk about how neuroscience has basically set up this paradigm where it's like, don't question our basic assumptions.
It's still worded like that, isn't it, everywhere? Sorry to interrupt you. It's just, it jumped into my mind that you see like the way when they word it, it'd say like, how can we, or when will we understand how the brain creates consciousness and things like that? Not just simply when will we understand how consciousness is created? How will we understand how the brain generates it or creates it and things like that? It's always, set with that predefined disclaimer of, it's the brain. Even though we don't know how it's happening, it's the brain. Exactly.
And so I sort of point out in my book that, that how problematic that is, and, we don't really understand, we really don't understand anything within neuroscience. I mean, all we have is some correlations, which correlations are not causation. And then we have a lot of mysteries. And then we have a lot of these mysteries, like, for example, Savant Syndrome, where it's just like, well, okay, we know it's real because we've seen it over and over again, where you have these individuals who have information that they can give you, and we don't know where the information comes from. That they just have these sort of almost like superpowers. And so it's reliable. They can do it, things like being able to give you, 10-digit prime numbers, just off the top of their head, when there's no real good algorithm for generating a prime yet, this person who's never gone to school, who can't even add, add 6 plus 14, can somehow give you, a 10 or 12-digit prime number. I mean, it's sort of like, that's interesting. And to me, that's as, I put that in the same level of, wow, that's an extraordinary phenomena that I would put this woman who knew that I had a husband who was applying for 2 jobs in chemistry. And so to me, it's like, well, why is it you accept this because it's been reliable, and yet this other thing that seems so similar that's been reported since antiquity, and cultures all across land. And you have a lot of people, I mean, it's a sizable portion of the public believes in psychic abilities. I mean, if you ask them about it, I'd say it's probably at least 2/3 of people do. And the number goes down, though, the more educated people get. And so it's almost like we get educated out of these things that we're told are it becomes a matter of what we get programmed to believe is real and possible.
Tell me if I'm wrong. Sorry, again, just to interrupt you really quickly again, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think I read somewhere that, kind of normal level scientists are less likely to be, believing, if we want to use that word, in psi phenomena. But then if you go up another level, I think to PhDs and things like that, then I think they are more likely than the average public. I think I've read something like that. I don't know the exact levels and tiers in this whole thing, but I think there was something to that effect where it was kind of, you've 2/3 of, say, the general public, and then 50% of, say, scientists of a certain level, and then a higher percentage again of the PhDs and things like that.
Well, that's because, the PhD, what is that? What is that? PH is for philosophy, So when you get a PhD in science, you're actually getting, a degree in the philosophy of that particular scientific discipline. And so you're meant to be thinking beyond just the basic building blocks.
Yeah.
And so in order to get a PhD, you've got to do something original. And you've got to be, able to sort of speculate into the future. And so a lot of the undergraduate science degrees, it's just spit out what you've learned, or prove to us that you know how to do this, to tell us what the result of this chemical reaction will be, or or solve this equation, or tell us, whatever. So, but when you get to the level of a PhD, you're supposed to be doing, stretching science a little bit. And some people, what they do for their PhD is they're mainly filling in gaps that, and reconfirm, adding things that confirm somebody else's theory, and they're working out of that. But then there are people that like myself and other members of my family who that's just not the kind of scientist we wanted to be. I wanted to stretch science in a way that's beyond just filling in somebody else's theory, and you have to be willing to you have to be willing to be there at the fringe, just sorting through. It's kind of like, I like to go to thrift shops, and sometimes you run into treasures at a thrift shop, and sometimes you run into a bunch of junk, but you realize that there might be something of value there, and you're not feeling like, well, gee, I don't want people to see me shop anywhere other than Bloomingdale's. It's kind of like, it's like that attitude. Instead, I'm more like, okay, I'll go do, I'm not exactly doing dumpster dives, but I'll go into a thrift shop to see if there's something of value there, an analogy. And so in my book, I talk about how the model within neuroscience it's not complete, and I describe some of the problems with it. And as a neuropsychiatrist, I'm aware of all of these syndromes and things that conditions that people have presented with. That it's like they're informing us about something about this relationship between the mind and the brain, so I talk about that. And then because when I was a child, I was a math prodigy, and everyone assumed I was either going to become a mathematician or a physicist. And I have a younger brother who became a theoretical physicist, and he's an expert in AI. And he and I would have these conversations about consciousness, and so I have an understanding it from the standpoint of somebody with his kind of background. And so in the book, I also talk about physics in a way that I'm writing it so that people who don't have a background in physics, a lot of people have said that one of the things I do well is I I can explain concepts that and put them in terms that then other people can understand it who don't have my kind of background. And so I talk about things like Einstein's perspective on time, and how
Right.
how our sense of time is an illusion, and and quantum physics and what that tells us about the nature of reality, and how much of what we think of as reality is really a synthesis. It's really a lot of what we think of is it could be a computation. And and I talk about the role that consciousness plays in co-creating that reality. That's one of the things that the famous double slit experiment tells us about, how there's a difference. If you're observing something, you'll get a different outcome than if you're not observing it. And so what is it about that measurement that changes the outcome? And if you look at who we are as beings, aware sentient beings, with all of these sensory receptors, and I think of the mind as another sense, we're measuring all the time. We're measuring and defining all the time. And so I talk about the physics of why, and why the physics actually, if you look at the physics that we have accepted, I mean, this is what we teach in, schools now. If you look at the physics from 100 years ago, this is 100 years ago. You look at how it's revolutionized everything. Some of it good, some of it not so good. The physics that brought us, nuclear weapons, the physics that brought us, the physics that brought us the technology we're using today, that in this Zoom call. If you look at all of that physics, that gives us the cloud, and why is it that we're excluding that physics and somehow not thinking that it applies to biology? Why is it that we're not then saying, wow, if that is the physical world that we live in, then what are its implications for what is possible and not possible? And if anything, so you have a neuroscience model that's incomplete, and then you have a physical model that actually predicts these kinds of things. If our sense of time being an arrow that just moves in one direction only is correct, if our perception that that's what it is were correct, then that would go against what Einstein said. And if what Einstein said is correct, then you would anticipate that there might be hiccups that show up in human consciousness, such that time is not always linear for somebody. That you might have people who actually experience something, like precognition, or even something like time travel.
Yeah.
And then lo and behold, you find out that there are people who do have those experiences, and have experiences that have actually been validated. And so then it's like, okay, why don't we just make a scientific case? And that's what my book's doing, is why don't we make a scientific case for why we need to not throw these phenomena out, call people who have them crazy, which is problematic to me. It's problematic in terms of psychiatry, because you're going to put people on medication because they insist, that they've had a certain experience. What if they actually had that experience? Or the experience is so real to them, there's no medication that's going to take that away. And then who are we to say, what that person really experienced? And as psychiatrists, we're kind of the gatekeepers of what's considered normal within our experience. And so what happened was, as I wrote this book, that the other part of it is that I also just did kind of a review of some of the research, with much of which was funded by funded by our own government, military intelligence, for decades was doing this kind of research. This kind of research was being done by Russia, and so it was, and it was funded for decades, and they wouldn't have kept funding it if they weren't having success with it. And then when Russell Tarr came out, and was able to declassify, the stuff was declassified, and he was able to talk about what had been declassified of his research. I'm just like looking at the remote viewing and whatnot. I'm saying, okay, there's also a substantial amount of research we haven't been told about. So I go into some of that in my book, and then, and then I just make an argument that, let's expand our view of, of what is possible, and look at these questions, from a more balanced view instead of, a scientifically biased one.
Yeah, exactly. A scientifically open-minded view. Yeah, it's very important. Tell me, I'd love to learn a little bit more about Savant Syndrome that you have obviously done a lot of work with and a lot of research into. I guess, first of all, what exactly is it? How would you define it? And what is the kind of the link between that and autism? Can you kind of go into those? Thanks.
Sure. So savant comes from savoir, which is Latin for to know, right? And so going back literally hundreds of years, that there have been accounts of these individuals who just know things that you just like, how do they know that? So an example is this: there was this boy who back in 1800 was he never had gone to school, and he was with his father, and he was only 5 or 6 at the time, and all of a sudden he just started speaking in mathematical formulas. And and it's like, imagine being with a kid that's all of a sudden going saying something like 3x plus 2y equals 4z, and then solving the equation for all of the variables, and what cube root of this and that is, and all of a sudden it's talking about all this stuff. It's just like, and so the father was just like blown away by it. And the child was evaluated by a number of people. They're just like, yeah, these are mathematical equations, and he's solving them correctly. And he has no background in this. And so he became a bit of a, it's kind of like, this is back in the days when you had circuses and, that would parade people around, this is the strong man, this is the woman with the beard, this is the, all of that.
Yeah, the freak show kind of thing.
The freak show, yeah. And so he became, kind of, somebody, the people go, oh, the Wonder Boy, whatever. And he was written up in this, it was like a journal, I guess you would call it, a journal from back then, like something that came out, like once a year or whatever. And so these kinds of cases, or somebody who, another example of a savant skill are these children who have hyperlexia, where you can have like a 4-month-old or a 6-month-old that can read. Okay. And it's like, how is it that they're able to read?
And they can speak as well, or how I'm guessing that's how we'd know they can read. But do they read out loud?
Well, so you have where they can read out loud. Well, it's more of like a recognition. Okay.
Yeah, showing some kind of comprehension.
Showing some kind of comprehension. Okay. So for example, being able to recognize, a street sign, and knowing, that those letters coming together, that's the street that, we live on, kind of thing, and so, so for example, this one boy that I done research with, he started reading when he was about 4 months old, and by the time he was 2 years old, he knew the alphabet and can do preliminary reading in 8 different languages. And he was able to 8 languages. I mean, his mother discovered him one day. He was drawing. He was basically drawing, Arabic. The Arabic alphabet looks very different. He was drawing Arabic symbols, and he was drawing symbols from, the Hindu alphabet, and he was, um, so he was, and then he could read and speak some Spanish, and Japanese and Russian. And I mean, these are all very different languages from one another. And he was just, so savants oftentimes have this almost obsession with things that are symbolic. And what's interesting is that they oftentimes combine with that, have something called synesthesia, which is where you have you either have a blending of two senses. For example, you see colors when you hear certain tones, or it could be a blending of symbols with a sense. So, the common one is seeing colors with different letters. And so most of the savants that I work with have synesthesia of one form or another. And so that's kind of, in a nutshell, what Savant Syndrome is. And they can acquire, languages, very rapidly, and their memories can be phenomenal. Like, so Kim Peek was the savant that Rain Man was modeled after. And Kim Peek, by the time he died in his 50s, had memorized effortlessly. Okay, you have to realize that their memory is that they're not sitting there saying over and over and over again to themselves to try to memorize something. They just read it and they've got it. Yeah. He had memorized over 12,000 books, and he could recite them forwards and backwards.
That's just insane.
And yet this is someone who you measured his IQ, and his IQ fell into the mentally retarded range.
Yeah. Wow.
And he was he also could give you the directions between any two cities. Knew all the highways and this and that, but it's not that he, and you have to realize a lot of this is before the internet, it's just like, but it's just like he could look at a map and just retain all of that information and the relationships of things. And so you have these people who are savants. And one of the things that's part of Savant Syndrome, though, is that it's not just that they know these extraordinary things, but then they also have these, usually some kind of disability or handicap in addition to that. So, it's like, well, they can do all of that, but they can't function independently. They can't, they can't, dress themselves, or they can't cook for themselves, or they they just, so it's this interesting combination. And that's one of the reasons why Daryl Trefford had called it Islands of Genius, because it's as though they've got like this patch of this patch of their brain or consciousness that's absolutely genius, and yet then there's these other areas of deficit. And so to me, I mean, that's a perfect scenario for trying to understand the kind of thing that I want to understand. Is like, what's different about people that have these extraordinary experiences in which they know things that we're like, how do they know that?
Yeah. And
so getting back to and I can go on about that. Let me say a little bit about that, and then I'll get back to my book, because I haven't completely answered your questions about my book. So with Savant Syndrome, I said, well, that is so close to ESP. I don't even understand why we don't, consider that to be one of the things, that we think of as psi. So within psi, we think of telepathy and precognition and something called psychokinesis, where your mind is able to change something in the physical world. Whether it, one of the common things is, to be able to get, something to move within, like it's contained within a jar, such that you can't touch it or, have any kind of air movement or anything influence it, and yet you want it to move and it'll start moving. That's kind of an example of psychokinesis. Remote viewing. I'm seeing things at a distance. Those are all considered psi abilities, and I'm just like, well, what about being able to do complex mathematics, and you've never studied mathematics? That sure seems to me like that should fall in that category as well. And so when I looked into Bernard Rimland, who was the father of an autistic individual who had studied over 6,000 cases of autism, he was a psychologist. When I looked at his work, I saw that he said that basically of the people that he studied, he thought about 3% of them had ESP, and he thought ESP was a savant skill. So he and I were on the same page. And he told stories of these kids who would know things that is like, well, how do they know that? It just for example, knowing exactly when somebody was going to come pick them up. They'd go wait by the door. Similar to Rupert Sheldrake's work about dogs that seem to know when their master is coming home. They would go to they'd go and wait at the front door, and he has some interesting things where he studies in which the person's heading out the door to go home, and the dog goes to the door, and then the person goes, oh, wait a minute, I better do this thing before I leave work. And then they go and sit back down at their desk, and then you see the dog leave the door and go back and sit back on the sofa. Because, and then when the person actually then is leaving, then they go back to the door. So it's kind of this interesting in parallel where you see that there's some connection happening there where they're kind of an awareness. And so he described that kind of thing with some of these children, and so I thought, well, that's interesting, because that makes sense to me. And the other thing that I thought about is well, let's look at, what's the brain functioning of somebody who's a savant, and most people with Savant syndrome have autism. Okay.
So it's
not all. In fact, Rain Man, the one that made Savant syndrome so famous, he was actually born with hydrocephalus. So he wasn't really autistic. There's a lot of similarities between the behavior of people with hydrocephalus and autism, but they're not one and the same. And so Kim Peek, here he is. He's born with hydrocephalus, which is where you have a blockage that prevents you from the fluid that's in the brain that prevents it from draining properly or something. Somehow the pressure builds up. Okay, and so when the child is in their first year or two of life, before the fontanelles fuse, the skull can expand, and so if you look at Kim Peek's head, his head was significantly larger than most people's heads because it had undergone that expansion, and he was born without the corpus callosum, which is the major group of fibers that connect the left and the right hemisphere, and so he's got this big hole in the center of his brain, and yet here he has this amazing memory, and yet, he's got a very disconnected brain. And on top of that, he was capable of reading 2 books simultaneously, one with each eye.
Yeah, so that's hard to get my head around,
Yeah. So, here he is able to read 2 books simultaneously, one with each eye, and have complete recall of them, so, and yet his brain's got this big hole in the center, but, and so it's this well, that then I discover that there are all of these other people who were born with hydrocephalus who similarly have big holes in the center of their brain, and yet they can appear totally normal. So it's like, there are these things that are kind of defying, neuroscience's model, and yet we ignore them.
Because that's why we ignore them.
that's why we ignore them. And to me, it's like they shine, like a beacon of light, and say, no, wait a minute, that's the last thing that you should ignore. So the other people who have Savant syndrome to a significant degree are people who were either born with or developed within the first year of life blindness, blindness that is not cortical blindness. In other words, it's not a blindness because of damage to the brain that's involved in sight. It's damage to the anterior part of the, so it's the eyes, or the optic nerve, or something interior, but the visual cortex is still totally intact. Mm-hmm. And so in both of these instances, with autism, with autism, hydrocephalus, and blindness, it's all occurring before the brain has really, completed all of its wiring, and so, it's sort of like, so something is directing the rewiring, and let's find a hack let's find a hack and a loop, a workaround, so that we can still, navigate still, because there are people who lose their eyes early in, the first year of life, and they're able to climb mountains, because they can do echolocation, where they can emit clicks from their mouth and process the bounce back, the sonar bounce back that comes back from it, and figure out what their physical world is like around them. So it's like they're using sonar, just like whales use sonar or whatever.
I actually spoke to somebody that uses it. Eric Weinmeier. I spoke to him for the podcast, and he didn't lose his sight when he was like a toddler or anything, but I think it was in his early teenage or mid teenage years, and he taught himself that, where he's learned how to do that echolocating, and the brain kind of fills in, like you're saying, like the gaps. It's incredible.
It is, and it's really profound if it's something that happens within the first 4 years of life, because that's when the brain is really very, very adaptive, and the brain undergoes another remodeling when you go through puberty. Hormones play a huge role in modeling the brain. So anyway, so when I looked at, well, what is, in general, so yes, you've got this rewiring of the brain that goes on, but in general, if you look at the actual functioning of the brain, in somebody who's autistic, and you look at what savant skills are, what you see is that they have what we consider, and this is overly simplistic, but for the purposes of this interview, I'll just make it simplistic, that they have left hemisphere deficits frequently. In other words, that the left hemisphere is what we associate with linear thinking and language. Mm-hmm. And if you look at what they have, their gifts are, their right hemisphere skills, where they are really good at visual spatial processing, really good at intuition, and really, really good at, picking up patterns, and, so it's a lot of savants, are musical prodigies, for example, and this ability to hear something and then play it, so what you have is you have right hemisphere super skills and left hemisphere deficits. And one of the things that we know is that the left hemisphere, which is more active in our waking life, suppresses the right hemisphere. Okay, so it dominates, and so we spend a lot of time in this sort of more linear way of processing the world. But when we're in dreaming sleep, that reverses, and the right hemisphere becomes the dominant one, and the left hemisphere is suppressed. And that's why in our dreams, they can be so nonlinear. Anything can they can be intuitive, they can be nonlinear. We can process a lot of information in a very condensed way. And so, I'm thinking, well, isn't that interesting? Because even people who don't consider themselves psychic can have psychic dreams.
Mm.
But with these autistic savants, their brain is showing the reversal of the normal pattern during waking life. So it's like they're operating out of that modality, 24/7. And and what is that like? What is that like if we, if we had that kind of capacity during waking life? What is that like? And some of the EEG research on some psychics that has been done, sometimes you'll see like this brainwave pattern that is a mixture between the waking and the dream sleep. You'll see like, oh, it's like you've got some REM intrusion on your waking life,
Right.
and so it's kind of, isn't that interesting? And so that's the way I kind of think of it. It's like we have these two different ways of processing what we think of as reality, and they're usually kept separate from one another, and we're usually pretty amnestic for the dreaming part. So we all have this capacity. It's just that most of us spend most of our conscious and what we remember time in the left brain, which keeps us in a very restricted way of thinking about things, because it's so linear in the way that it processes. And so anyway, so that's so that was one of the reasons. That, plus, as I said, some of these savant skills being so similar to ESP, that was one of the reasons why I started focusing on savants. So back to my book. So what happened was when I wrote my book, I mean,
we can come back to savant after your book, if that's all right.
Because I want to ask
you a few questions about it.
Well, I just wanted to say, with my book, it was extremely well received. It was reviewed favorably by 3 of the major reviewing houses that librarians use. And so my book is in a lot of different libraries. It's even in university libraries. It was reviewed favorably by my alma mater, Johns Hopkins Medical School. There are physicians who trained at Johns Hopkins that read about my book in the alumni magazine and bought a copy, read it, and then went from being somebody who, just never really thought about it to somebody who actually had some of these experiences themselves afterwards, because the book gave them, it's sort of like it gives you permission if you see that, oh, well, gee, this doesn't mean I'm crazy. It just means that there is a scientific basis for this, that it does make sense. Why not? Then you actually find that you can start having some of those experiences sometimes, because belief gets in the way oftentimes of our beliefs are one of the major limiting forces that we have.
Yeah.
But the fallback came from when I was doing my book tour and giving talks and whatnot. The fallback came from a psychiatrist who told the board that it was dangerous for me to be practicing, because I had written a book on ESP. She didn't even read the book. She just saw the title.
Classic.
And accused me of magical thinking, and said I was a danger, and told the board they needed to remove my license immediately, which they did. And then I had to go and prove my sanity, which I did. at great expense, but all of this was at great expense to me. But anyway, and so then, I got my license back as soon as it was possible, which was at the next board meeting. And that was all, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, leave psychiatry on my own terms. I didn't want somebody else to tell me I couldn't do it. And
Yeah.
but it made me realize how important it's on the one hand, it shows how scary it is to go against the paradigm.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, it also made me realize also just how much more important it is that we really look at this paradigm, and because that, to me, if we're going to be that narrow-minded, and how we approach things, then to me that's, a contraction rather than an expansion of human potential.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. It's just unbelievable though that she said that people accused you and said like, oh yeah, she should have a license taken away, and it's hard to comprehend. I mean, I know we're still probably in that world now. Like that could probably happen today to somebody, and but I do think we've probably advanced a little bit in terms of how society and science look at these things, but maybe not enough. What do you think?
I think we have. I do think that we have. Things have come a long way since then. I mean, one of the yeah, I mean, now it's become sort of almost fashionable for some of the medical schools to have, programs in meditation, and, and to be, even, talking about, psychedelics and using them as a therapeutic tool again. They were used as a psychotherapeutic tool decades ago, and then banned, and now they're being brought back again.
Yeah.
I think that we're getting closer to the paradigm shifting, and part of that is because it your generation, people that are younger than me, who grew up with Harry Potter, and and all of the and all of the people that grew up with Star Trek, and all of these things that have helped prepare people for even imagining what this looks like, or what it means, or even having a way of wrapping your head around it. I mean, I think I think all of that needed to happen first. Yeah, we now have, I can say that, well, I think, that a better way of thinking about the brain is to think of the brain as being like my smartphone, and consciousness as being like cloud, and that I'm really just
Data.
surfing, I'm just surfing that, and most of us just have a very narrow bandwidth, that we're just focused on that, which is really more reliant upon memory, which is more like your browsing history. And that, but when you have someone like one of these autistic savants who are sort of kind of, doing their own thing, not really under social influence, but, it's like, well, maybe they just, they just search wherever they tend to get focused on certain areas, but they tend to, just then, it's just like they can access all this kind of information from that. And it's information that is not at all relevant to survival.
Yeah.
Whereas, and so that maybe that's one of the clues is, that we're designed mainly for, what's relevant, and what's going to keep me
What's in front of us.
what's in front of us, so that we can, take care of that business. But, with an autistic person, the survival stuff, they're more dependent upon others to help them oftentimes. And so if that's the case, then their mind, their consciousness can focus on whatever it is that just seems to grab their curiosity.
Yeah. I got a few other questions about Savant Syndrome, as you may imagine, because it's fascinating. We could probably talk about it for hours. Where do I begin? I guess, have you kind of thought about, I'm sure you have, photographic memory? People that have like photographic memory, does that link in? Is that connected? Is that a kind of an element of Savant Syndrome? Like if somebody has a photographic memory where they can, like we said earlier, kind of glance at a page of a book and then recite it or tell you whatever is on which line. Is that connected? Because it seems on the face of it that it would be, but what do you think about that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I would say that many of them have a photographic memory. And then you have to say, well, what is a photographic memory?
Mm.
And it's not just a photographic memory in the sense of looking at a book and then just revisiting that page when you need to, which is oftentimes what people with a photographic memory will say that they do, is that they, it's like, oh, I'm taking my history test now. Let me go back to let me go back to the section in the book that was talking about whatever, and then they go back there and they reread it again, and they in their mind, okay, they're rereading it again. Well, what is that? And we don't really have a good model for how that could be happening just because of neurons connecting with other neurons. I mean, that just doesn't make sense to me. I really think that it could be that they go back to that moment in time when they saw that page, that it could be a form of time travel, which sounds
like remote viewing, time
yeah,
travel,
just like remote viewing is okay. What's located over here. And some of the remote viewers could do it based on just coordinates. They're told, how many degrees north and how many degrees west, and what's right there. And didn't even need to have somebody there looking at it. If they had somebody there looking at it, then it to me it's more like telepathy. But they would actually just go to that location, and so that's non-local in space. Well, non-local in time, an example of that might be the photographic memory. And so, so I think that we can be capable, and I think it's easier for us to understand how we might be able to do remote viewing from our own past. That somehow seems less of a stretch for people, because I think we all have different degrees to which we can go back and relive an experience. And some of us will have a more vivid reliving than others. And the most vivid reliving experience are the people that have PTSD, which is another population that I've done a lot of research with. They're people who are severely traumatized, and they can actually think that they are back reliving, whatever that trauma was. They can temporarily get very disoriented in time. And so to me, that's very interesting that they do that. To me, that's kind of like a form of time travel. And once again, it's easier for us to comprehend because most of us, to some degree, have that, where we smell a smell, it takes us right back to when we were whatever, a kid with our grandma who wore that perfume, or whatever it is. Well, if time is nonlinear, then we might be able to also have time travel into the future, and there are people who have what are described as future memory episodes, and I talk about that in my book as well. Where it's they have they literally have superimposed upon their current circumstances a full-fledged episode from the future that then comes to pass. It might be 2 days later, it might be a month later, it might be 3 years later, but when it comes to pass, they recognize, oh my God, this is like extreme deja vu, because it's not just this vague sense of, oh, I think I've been here before, but they're literally be able to say, if they were able to do like a kind of a like, okay, in 3 seconds he's going to say, listen for it. Then you hear the person say it, and think, okay, now this is what's going to happen. And then you see it happen. It's like they're able to, they know exactly what's going to be said. They know exactly how things are going to play out. It's though the whole thing is like a movie reel, Groundhog Day or whatever, it's a movie reel, and you've seen this whole thing before.
I actually, funnily enough, just to quickly interrupt, I spoke to somebody very recently, one of my recent episodes, Dr. Michael Masters. He's he an anthropologist, biological anthropologist, and he kind of has been looking into the idea that potentially UFOs could be humans coming back from the future. He's a very serious guy. It sounds kind of a bit out there when you first hear it, but anyway, he has had these experiences throughout his life, like he put them as precognitive moments, where he would remember something when he was 20 and like having a kind of vision of him with a young child talking about something, and then in the future 20, 30 years later he's having this experience with his son sitting on the bed and they talk about, I can't remember, cats and prisoners having cats or something like that, and he's like, no way, like that's. And he talked about a few other experiences. It was just so recent that I just wanted to butt in and tell you, but please carry on.
Well, that's I mean, the main thing I wanted to say about it. One of the things that's interesting is that when I looked at the future memory episodes as they were described, there's this whole that there's a prelude that the person gets. There's a way in which they experience, sort of like it's almost like when you're changing channels on something, where they start seeing like little lights, little scintillations, or something, so it's almost like there's something that shifts like this, that they then enter into this reality, which like a dream is compressed. I mean, they may, only be gone from, what you think of as the present time, for 1 second, yet like a dream, it's compressed in the sense that you could have what we think of as events that would take normally 30 minutes to transpire. It all happens within that 1 second. And so it's like it's so just like, once again, we can imagine what compression is like, because we have computers in which if I want to send a video file to somebody, if I don't have it compressed, it's going to be too large for me to send it as an attachment to an email. I've got to somehow, condense it down, and then it needs to get unzipped or expanded at the other end. So there's some way in which we can do, these people who are having future memory, it's like they're doing that. It's like they're getting information from the future that's in a very compressed form, that then plays out in a future date in its more expanded form. But because you've already experienced the condensed version of it, you've got all the information there. And what's interesting is that there are similarities, and I read about this in my book. There are similarities between that prelude to that future memory experience and what happens when people have a temporal lobe seizure. And, which is interesting, the temporal lobe is it relates to time, tempus, time. And so isn't it interesting that the region of the brain that is named for something that has to do with time actually seems to have something to do with time? And the region of the brain that I've been the most interested in is the area of the brain that is where the parietal cortex, which is like the strip along the side of your brain here, where the parietal cortex, which has more to do with our body sensation. Okay, the parietal cortex has more to do with all of our sensory information that gives us a sense of being embodied. And you've got your motor cortex and your sensory cortex. And this little man. It's like it's all mapped out on your brain as to which part of, it's like, where the feet are and the mouth is and all of that. It's all mapped out, and so you've got that parietal lobe, and then you've got the temporal lobes, which if you think of it like a plucked chicken, you have how you have the legs of the chicken kind of come out like this. Okay, well, the temporal lobes are like that. They kind of come out like this. Okay, you've got these two sections like this, and they kind of bulge out a little bit. And so the area where the two meet, the parietal and the temporal, that junction there's an area near there called the angular gyrus, and if you stimulate that area of the brain, you can create a simulation of an out-of-body experience. It's not a complete out-of-body experience, but it's a simulation of an out-of-body experience. Similarly, it's an area that area of the brain is also associated with synesthesia. And so, which is something that a lot of these autistic savants have.
Yeah.
And so I think that the key to understanding them comes from that section of the brain. That section of the brain is also involved in calculation. And that section of the brain was also had an increased amount of white matter, which is involved in cognitive processing. And I've talked about this elsewhere, the role of white matter, which is opposed to gray matter, which is the neurons. White matter is all of the connecting, glial cells that have been way underestimated in terms of what they do. Well, that section of the brain was the area that was the most different in Einstein's brain from other regions. And so the very person who did these thought experiments that changed the nature of how we thought about time had something different about the section of his brain that I've identified as what I think is the most likely to be involved in Savant Syndrome and time travel and all this other stuff. Isn't that interesting? And so what I'm interested in doing, what I'm wanting to do is to study the brain functioning of as many savants as possible to kind of test out some of these hypotheses.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. How many have you studied so far? How many people with the syndrome?
Well, I've
again, approximately. It doesn't have to be an exact figure.
It depends upon what level of studying you want to say. I mean, I've gone and actually physically met with about 6 savants where I've done experiments with them, and but I'd say, oh gosh, I don't know, at least I've spoken with the families of at least 30 of these kinds of individuals that have these abilities, and I'm it's once again funding has always been an issue, and so
Yeah.
I've been working on getting funding for it, and one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm working with somebody who's a filmmaker, and we're what we want to do is we want to do a documentary series that would be my research.
Brilliant. Yeah, that sounds amazing. I'd love to watch it. I look forward to it. So these, it's normally children, right, that you've been looking at. But these people, they have access to languages that they haven't been taught or that their family doesn't speak. They have unbelievable musical ability, or they can pick things up very easily, and they're kind of aware of things and have skills in things sometimes that just doesn't make sense for the life of the person, right? So I guess the big question is obviously, where is it coming from? Where is this information coming from? What are your thoughts on that? Like, is it like that they're accessing something from, like the conscious universe? Is it something from past lives? Is it something, are they different again? Is it, again, I know we've drawn a lot of similarities with Psi, and you think it should be considered in that area. But yeah, as well, are you aware, or have you asked any of them whether I don't know if there's been any research looking into people with Savant Syndrome and whether they've reported any memories of a past life potentially in their earlier life or something along those lines?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Some of them definitely remember past lives.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, I had somebody refer to me just the other day who remembers past lives. And
so is that more common then, that somebody with Savant Syndrome would remember a past life than somebody in the normal population, do you think? Or?
I can't answer that from the standpoint that I haven't actually been able to do, I haven't done a survey
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I suspect that's the case, but I can't say for sure. But
Yeah.
my thinking about this is that it may be that all of these things that we think of as separate, things like remembering past lives or being
Mm.
able to do, solve mathematical problems without having studied math, or knowing languages, picking up languages so quickly, it's as though you knew them. So sometimes people
Yeah.
have such remarkable skills so early on, they may not remember a past life, but is it that they're remembering the past life skills?
Mm.
And so to me, it may be that all of those things are really the same phenomena, that they have access to the information that most of us lose when we become embodied.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the simplest analogy that I've come to explain this, is that what if we really do live in a simulation, and it's not, whatever you think that simulation is created by, you think the simulation is created by God, or ETs, or some big computer in the sky, or consciousness itself, or whatever it is you think that creates, or we live in a block universe in which the past, present, and future all coexist. Everything is just all there. Okay, all knowledge, everything is all there, and it's holographically organized such that it's available to every one of us in every single point in space time. Okay, each one of those is a place from which you can then branch out to all of it. Okay, so what if it's all, whatever your way of organizing all of that is, and just view it as like it's all that. What if these savants, who have difficulty with, a lot of them have difficulty with moving their bodies, or they have difficulty with some sensory system like their eyesight or whatever. What if, because of that, what we call a disability, what if that means that they're not as immersed in the simulation?
Mm-hmm.
What if it's like, oh, you got a faulty, virtual reality kit, and so you're, everybody else is like, just, enjoying, whatever their virtual reality is, and you're there with the faulty virtual reality kit, in which you've got all this other reality available to you that you haven't blocked out because you're so immersed in the virtual reality kit, that was given to you, such that you can't distinguish virtual reality from reality. What if that's the case with these savants? And to me, I think that's it's a hypothesis that I came up with, and then I discovered, a lot of people in mainstream academia are, embracing this idea. I mean, it's not the mainstream paradigm at this point, but a lot of them are embracing the idea that, yeah, we might live in a simulation, and so, what if these savants are evidence for that?
Yeah.
And if they are, can we prove that? So anyway, so that's kind of my thinking about it. And then everything, it's like all of these phenomena, become possible. And then, and the question is, as I said, the main thing is, can we test that hypothesis? Can we test it? It's so anyway, so that's kind of my thoughts on it.
Yeah. I mean, it's so fascinating. What does what does mainstream science kind of do with savant syndrome? Because we know what they do with psi and everything like that. They, like we said, they ignore it. They gloss over it. They say there's faulty methods. They say there's the file draw problem, whatever. Yeah, selective reporting, and however they want to kind of try and dismiss it, they'll try and dismiss it, or, as we say, ignore it. But what do they do with this? Because this is a phenomena that's accepted, obviously, in mainstream. It's not something that people like, oh, you believe in Savant Syndrome? Like that's not real. But it's just a given that it's a real thing. It's not a matter of opinion or belief. But what do they do with it? How do they try and explain it? Do they have an explanatory framework, or?
They don't have an explanation for it. They can't dismiss it. They know it's real. But they also don't have an explanation, and so that's what I'm saying. It's one of those mysteries. I mean, and in my book, I go into other mysteries. It's just one of those mysteries that they can't deny. And so it'd be one thing if neuroscience had a model that explained everything but psi, and then you could say, but it doesn't explain much of anything. and so it's like and so to dismiss any information is to me, if there's evidence for it. I mean, it'd be one thing if all we had was just people that saw fortune tellers and people that who were gypsies who were making a buck off of them and whatnot, and we were but there's actually been very serious scientific research that's been done on these phenomena going back decades, and there are a lot of famous scientists that over the years who accepted this stuff as real, that and so to dismiss all of that to me is tremendous hubris to do that, and it's a mistake. Especially
absolutely.
These abilities could be something that could potentially help us a lot as a human species.
Definitely. I mean, the potential there is enormous, and ignoring it is a fatal error. It's maybe partly with the stigma and the taboo, and as you say, that's hopefully waning now, and we're moving forward through that. So maybe, like you say, we're on the cusp of a complete changing of the paradigm, a complete shift. What about telepathy in children that have, I mean, it doesn't have to be just children, but I think that's kind of more where your research has been. But telepathy with people that in people that have autism, but not necessarily Savant Syndrome. Have you looked into that as well?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. That's been Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just I know I'm conscious we haven't got very long left, but maybe just briefly you can kind of talk a little bit about that.
Well, I would say that my work on telepathy, let's use the word telepathy.
You can give me your 10-second definition of the word as well if you want, because
when people think of telepathy, they think of somebody being able to. Usually, people think of it as somebody's reading their mind. Okay, somebody's reading my mind.
What am I thinking about?
What am I thinking about? And so I'd say at least twice a month I get an email from somebody saying, I have this kid, they're autistic, and I had these experiences that I just can't deny anymore. I really think that he or she is reading my mind, and I thought I was crazy, or this goes against everything I believe, or some people, it comes from a religious background in which they're wondering whether or not this is something to be scared of or evil, or I mean, I get all these emails from people who they're not trying to. They're honest inquiries. They're not trying to win the Amazing Randy prize of $1 million. They're not trying to pull anything over on me. They're literally telling me stories of just these uncanny things that happen with their kid, where, like one father told me, he was like wondering, where is my, he was wondering, he's like, where's my blue shirt? I need my blue shirt. And he's just thinking this to himself in his bedroom because he's wanting to wear his blue shirt. And then all of a sudden, his autistic son comes running into the room with his blue shirt and hands it to him, another kid who the teacher who's coming in to work with them to work on the homework, who thinks the child is a mathematical savant because she can give you, I mean, just, right off the top of her head, she can give you the cube root of a large number, and, do all of these things that, show, superior mathematical mind that's not having to, go through a lot of steps to try to come to the answer. And then her calculator battery dies, and so she uses her iPad instead. And for some reason, the calculator on that was set to give the answer in logarithmic notation. And she glances over at the answer, and the kid who can't see her thing types out the answer in logarithmic notation. She's just like, well, wait a minute. every other thing you're giving me the answer in regular notation. Why are you giving this one to me in logarithmic notation? And the kid says, well, I can see I can see types. I can see the numerators and denominators in your head, and it's like, what? You can read my mind? Yeah, I can read your mind. Oh, well, what else can you tell me? What am I thinking now? And the kid does, it's just like, what the, and so I get these stories like this, and it's just like, well, what's going on there? And obviously, there's information that's being transmitted, okay? And to me, regardless of whether you believe it's something as complex as, that they're accessing the information, that all the information exists in the cloud, and they're somehow, tapping into that little bit of the cloud that is connected with, this person, what they're asking of you right now and what they know, is it that, or is it that there's a frequency or a vibration that is emitted when we have a thought, that we actually emit a vibration, and we know that we emit light, and we know that we emit, we have electromagnetic signals that we emit, and we know that we also, we emit vibrations. And is it that these kids are just picking up the signal in that vibration? Either way, it's a fascinating phenomenon. And I have given it great thought, and one of the things I've been wanting to do is to study it, because I have thoughts about, and I won't go into it now, but thoughts about how to parcel out what is happening. And those are the experiments that I think are very exciting to do, to try to really understand what's happening with these kids. Because clearly there's information transfer. It's just that people will disagree in terms of what the mechanism is.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, hopefully we'll be able to talk about that in a bit more detail next time. And it makes me think as well, when you say about, like vibration and things like that. We don't know how this stuff works. And it made me think of elephants, like how they can kind of communicate using vibration, and like some of the noises they make we wouldn't be able to hear it with our ears. But they are able to communicate. And so from like a layman's point of view, if you're just looking at them and they're communicating, it's kind of like telepathy, but in fact it's actual, it is vibration or frequency or whatever that's actually doing that. And I'm not saying that that's what's happening with us, but who knows if it's some kind of connection there. But obviously it's harder to work it out that way when you take into account the fact that distance and things don't seem to really make any difference with a lot of telepathy and remote viewing and everything like that.
Well, that's just it, is that the distance doesn't seem to make a difference. No. However, we can't say that every single phenomena that we see is exactly the same. In other words, I'm very familiar with the remote viewing literature that shows that distance doesn't matter. With these children, I would need to set up this experiment to see if distance doesn't matter for them, because it could be that what is happening there is yet, just another, extraordinary thing, like the person who can echolocate, that's extraordinary. Okay. But it's, so I don't want to, I can't speak beyond, you have to do the experiments and then, parcel out, well, what's the difference? And then I'd be interested in what's different in the brain activity of somebody who's remote viewing
Mm.
versus somebody who's doing something they can only do locally. It's so they're trying to tease apart these different things to understand.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And can you just mention, again, next time, hopefully we'll be able to go into these in detail, but just maybe you can kind of list a couple of the other syndromes or things that are kind of accepted in science, in the mainstream, but that are unexplainable via the mainstream paradigm. So Savant Syndrome is obviously the biggest example for now, the key example that we've discussed today. Kind of photographic memory, I guess, fits into that. Are there any other phenomena, syndrome that you've looked into?
I'm fascinated by what gets and a lot of people it's another area that's a little bit controversial, but it's multiple personality disorder.
Yeah.
And and the thing about multiple personality disorder that is so interesting to me is that, and I talk about this in my book a bit, is that people can actually have physical symptoms with one personality that don't exist with the other. In other words, you could have somebody who's highly allergic to, let's say, just name the thing, highly allergic
Peanuts.
to, pollen, or some drug, aspirin or something that has like a total body rash, because they're so allergic, and they shift personalities and the rash goes away.
Mm. Yeah, that's wild.
And it's just sort of like, and they can have just, and one personality can have no memory of the other personality. Okay, so it's as though you have two different consciousnesses that are both taking a lease out on the same body. Sort of like, I mean, that's how what it seems like. And they've got different sets of clothes, and they've got even different careers, and and it's just like. So that's one thing. And another thing would be the twins separated at birth, who live identical lives in many ways.
Yeah.
How is it that you can have these twins that are separated at birth, and when they are reunited 20, 30 years later, they're wearing the same clothes, that they're married to somebody with the same name. They even have a dog with the same name, they drive the same kind of car. It's just like, okay, you cannot explain that based on genetics. I mean, once again, there's only 20,000 genes or so in the human genome. And so, how do you explain those things, that we think that it's totally our consciousness, free will making these choices, and then you discover, well, wait a minute, there's someone else that I'm connected to by virtue of that. At one point, we came from the same cell, and yet we're still, we're still connected in some way. We're doing this thing that you'll see oftentimes identical twins who, and I have a whole chapter on twins in my book. You'll see identical twins that grew up in the same family that are more different than these identical twins raised apart, because the ones who grew up in the same family each have an incentive, by knowing the other twin exists, to differentiate themselves from that person and go, well, if that's what she's going to do, I'm going to do this, because I want to be my own person. So it's like, by being aware of the twin, they become a reaction to it. Whereas if they're separated at birth, they're then just going along the sort of some flow with their, the flow of their being that is so uncannily similar to their twin that it makes you wonder about this interconnection.
Yeah, definitely. That's fascinating. And I think it's fairly, I don't know if I should say common, but it's kind of a known thing, or at least I'm aware of it. I think that it's fairly frequent with twins to be able to kind of communicate telepathically or have little things like that, little kind of a connection that, and that's again something that maybe science doesn't, I don't know whether the mainstream science agrees with that, but I think a lot of people, just the masses would kind of say, oh yeah, like there's things with twins where they're able to, know something about each other, and it's kind of easier for people to accept than telepathy at large or these other psi phenomena at large in general. It seems like that's kind of an easier first step for some people to comprehend that twins have that.
Well, it is, yeah, and what's interesting, like the stories where you have these twins where they're playing on the playground and one of them gets injured and the other one develops a bruise at the same place in the same time, even though they didn't fall.
Really?
And it's just
Wow.
like, so. I mean, it's so so just like you have multiple personality, which it's almost like you have two different consciousness, conscious beings. They're each taking their time with that body. Like it's their avatars. Like, no, wait, well, I want to play with that avatar today, and then with the twins, it's sort of like you have, it's like the same consciousness is operating two bodies simultaneously.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really fascinating thought, isn't it? It's, wow. Well, yeah, I really hope we can dig deeper into these next time, into a few of these things. And I've got plenty of other questions that I didn't get to this time that I'll ask you next time. Let me just ask you one or two last things. I will get you out of here very soon. I wanted to ask, on your website, I saw you featured the question, I think it was maybe in the top left, but I can't remember. What is the full human potential? And I'm assuming it's probably there rhetorical, it's a rhetorical question. It's hard to answer something like that. But as of now, what do you think your best answer to that would be? What is the full human potential?
No, probably it's infinite.
Mm.
I think that if we live in an infinite universe, and we as conscious beings are here to evolve our consciousness so that we can experience the infinite. I mean, that's what a lot of these people who are on these paths to enlightenment are doing, is that they're wanting to reach the level of consciousness such that they're whatever you want to call it, at one with the universe, or have access to all of that. That's an infinite potential. And so we have these long traditions, like the Vedantas in India, that go back thousands of years, in which you have these people that they're phenomenal in what they're able to achieve. I mean, you have people who can survive for long periods of time when they're not eating or drinking anything. Mm. They're able to slow their metabolism down to such an extent. They're able to, I mean, the control that the mind can have over the body, or these people that are that will sit at the bottom of the bottom of the sea for long after, most of us would have to come up for air, without a mask.
And like Wim Hof as well. Wim Hof with like the cold stuff, like climbing Everest in swimming shorts and sitting in an ice, tub for an enormous length of time and things like that. And he says, that he's able to just have this level of control over his body, like you said there. It's just totally fascinating stuff.
Right, and so we never know what we don't really know what the limits are. So let's just say it's infinite, like the universe is infinite, and not impose some superficial, arbitrary limitation on it. And like once Sir Roger Bannister, broke the 4-minute mile. Okay, you had people breaking the 4-minute mile left and right.
Yeah. Once they realized it was possible.
Once you realize it's possible. And that's what I was saying that my book does for some people, is that it makes them go, oh yeah, I guess that is possible. And then they start having those experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can't wait to start having some experiences myself. Hopefully one day soon. The last thing I'll ask you, Diane, is if you've got a message or any, words you want to leave for people that have watched and listened to this today. It can be anything. No pressure.
Any message? Well, I would say one of the things is that I am looking to be, whether it's this, docuseries I'm working on or a podcast, whatever, I'm looking to be more in the public eye and available for people, because I think that we're really living at a really important time in we're living at a very, very important time, and I want to be available to people. And so I'm thinking of doing a podcast in which people could call in and just
Cool.
ask me whatever they want to ask me, throw it at me, and let's have fun with it. So that's what I'm looking to create.
Awesome. So that would be like people asking you literally anything, or ringing you with their experiences and things like that, or they could come up with, scientific questions, anything.
It's people. What I'm wanting to do is, because I've thought about this. I mean, I practiced psychiatry for close to 40 years, and I've done a lot of good for people one-on-one, and people oftentimes would come to see me initially because they were suffering from depression, anxiety, whatever, you name it. And I would help them out, but then they would continue to come see me because they liked picking my brain. And I enjoy having that kind of a dialogue, in which people want to come to me with questions. So what I'm interested in people's stories of something that happened to them or somebody close to them that they're just puzzled by, and they're just like, what is this? It's kind of like the detective in me that likes, helping, people to make sense and find meaning in their own lives, but doing that in a way that's more public for people, because you're going to have people that listen to that other person's story who benefit from it. And so that's something I'm wanting to create. And if anybody's interested in helping me with that, they can contact me through my website.
Cool. I guess you have no idea when that would launch or anything at the moment?
No, I'm in the process of putting it together, and but you need help for these things. It's a lot of labor. You've got your own podcast, as you know. And
well, I'll talk to you about it after as well, and I'll help you in any way I can. What were you going to say? Sorry.
No, I'm just got a tickle in my throat.
Okay. But I was going to say, it's kind of so you'd play kind of detective, but also you'd act as kind of almost an unofficial therapist, not in any kind of, it's overstepping the mark, but in the sense of like, you're not crazy. These things happen, and I've heard this hundreds of times, and you're not alone, and that kind of thing. Yeah, that would be a big help for a lot of people, I think. So that sounds great. Anyway, I should let you get going. Thank you so much again for today, Dan. We're going to have to do another one. We left a lot on the table, but this was fascinating, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you to Diane Hennacy for talking with me, and thank you for listening. Please see the description for relevant links and other interviews you might enjoy, and please subscribe to continue unraveling the universe with us. If you're feeling extra generous and want to help us keep making content, you can contribute via Patreon from as little as €1 per month. Thank you.